Good morning. Welcome to episode 11. How are you?
Yeah, good man. How are you doing?
Good, good. And welcome to everyone else who's listening for the 11th time. And just a bit
Welcome.
of context, I think we should just quickly introduce how we got here. So we set out to talk about something completely different. And then we kicked off this morning's conversation talking about something completely different. And we decided to just continue talking about that because I'm quite biased and I'm quite interested in this space and what it all means. And I think it's quite urgent that we discuss about this and the implications for all of humanity. Um,
Damn.
right? And I think it's so like I'd like to hear what you think, but I think it's so relevant to what this whole project is about, right? Which is mental health, right? Which is unraveling the self, and we'll get into it, guys. But this topic I feel is directly related to what you and I have been trying to do with this, which is address all of the challenges that we face as human beings, right? With our thoughts and our emotions, etc. I think this particular topic threatens to rip the rug from right under our feet, right? And just completely take a lot of people by surprise.
Hmm.
I love your reactions, by the way. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about AI, the existential risk that's arising as a result of the latest advancements in AI, right? Does that title sound scary enough? Is it alarmist enough, I think?
um, yeah, no, I'm excited to talk about this
Mm,
because I mean the way that I see it, it's I can definitely see the risks involved, and some of the things that you mentioned before we started this, and we'll certainly go over during the course of this discussion. I'm excited to to hash it out, talk about
yeah,
it from two
awesome,
different perspectives.
awesome. So maybe let me try and do some justice to what I see as being the key risk, right, associated with AI. Um,
Yep.
and again, this is based on everything that I've read to date. So with the recent advancements in generative AI, you're seeing all sorts of capabilities sort of emerge, right? ChatGPT is the most common one. You now have an assistant that's as intelligent as most people are, with access to a wider range of information than you can possibly tap into, right? You can generate images from text, you can generate videos apparently from text, and there are a lot more capabilities, right? I'm just barely scratching the surface. But when you look at everything that's happening, the key question that comes up is one of the key questions for me is what does this mean for all of the people who will be displaced as a result, right? And if you look at a few reports that have come out, they do an assessment, and there are different manners in which they do this, but these assessments generally point out which kinds of professions are most at risk. And from what I've seen, knowledge workers, guys who or people who basically like consultants or lawyers, accountants and bookkeepers, most of these people, in addition to creatives, are screwed because whatever they can do can now be done by AI, right? So I think if you look at it from that front, and you think about the scale of which this will happen, it's quite scary, right? Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I know you were talking a little bit about how maybe there's no reason to be panicking as much because we've seen this before. But what do you think about that? Like just that statement.
Um, I think with anything new that is entering the mainstream, in the way that AI seems to be, it's understandable to definitely be going in with a degree of skepticism, right? Um,
Yeah.
if you look at the last 10 to 15 years, I would say that the rise and prominence of social media based companies, tech companies, weirdly weren't regarded with the same type of skepticism. And yet, when you look back at the 10 to 15 years that preceded that, or even 20 years, um, I think everyone kind of forgets how some people regarded the internet. In fact, I think there were many that were skeptical. There were many, actually, I would argue that the internet, people were skeptical in the sense that they didn't think it would amount to the kind of impact that it does now,
Mm.
right? And then the more previous wave with social media and tech companies, we just sort of like accepted it as, oh, cool, like this is nice, this is convenient. But I think the for those that are extremely skeptical of AI, I think a lot of it has to do with, I guess, to me anyway, the products of what's preceded it. And to me, it's actually like this huge flood of information and perspectives that, and also, I think, frankly, the inclination for many people to err towards fear and skepticism, that is, I think, driving this sort of cautious narrative towards AI. I'm not saying that these perspectives are wrong. I'm just saying that it's a perspective. Um, but I think also we should potentially keep an open mind because, for those that didn't with the internet, for example, there's many that kick themselves later on in the future thinking, oh, if only I had registered msn.com as a domain name, like I would have earned millions. Like it's just stuff like that.
Yeah.
um think about the situation, think about its potential impacts. You're right. I think the questions you're asking are important. What does this mean for for all the people that will be displaced? Who will it potentially displace? Who are most at risk? The scale at which this will happen, but also going into it with a certain degree of optimism as well, because it's while it is scary, it's also exciting to see what the potential aspects and things it could potentially fine tune and optimize. You mentioned like generating videos and pictures from text. I've seen some of these examples. In fact, Adobe and Photoshop sort of have this capability that they've implemented over the past few months, and it's fascinating. I think it's hugely exciting. But is it going to potentially displace an entire industry? Maybe, right? But we're also negating the fact that we as people are also very tied to our habits. And at the end of the day, we like dealing with people, or at least I think we do. I certainly do. So I think we're negating the human aspect of it. And so you mentioned earlier, right? Like that the intelligence levels of ChatGPT 4. What were you saying about that?
So ChatGPT 4, based on recent tests and claims, and how it performs on a specific IQ test, it tested at 155, right? Now the IQ test of Einstein came in at 160, right? So one of the smartest humans that ever lived, ChatGPT 4, is nearly as smart as Einstein. And if you think about it from the reverse perspective, that also means ChatGPT is smarter than 90 to 95 to 99% of humanity already. That's ChatGPT 4, right? What does this mean for later iterations of this particular technology, right? um, you're really sort of having to grapple with something that's never occurred, where a less intelligent species now has at its hands a much more intelligent tool, a tool that's far more intelligent than that species, right? So what does that look like? Nobody really knows, right? Um, and I think if you go back to some of the points that you were making earlier about, trying to take a balanced approach to this, I think that's always good advice in any situation. But I've still yet to be persuaded that that's the attitude we should be taking as it relates to this particular issue. And allow me to explain why, right?
Yeah,
Um,
let's hear it.
we've never encountered change or disruption at this scale in terms of the number of people it will impact simultaneously, nor have we seen this uh, been sort of instigated by technology that is like what we see today, right? Where it can rapidly learn and it can, make copies of itself, and it's just getting more and more access to data. The more often we interact with it, right? So it's a vastly different equation altogether than anything we've ever seen before, right? And the more important point here, I think, is when you talk about the actors, as in the human beings who are responsible, who are playing a part in this equation, right? Companies everywhere are incentivized to do what? Make a profit. That is the reason that companies exist. They don't exist to do good. That is something that they aspire for, but the fundamental objective of any corporate is to make money, right? Now, when you have a tool like AI that's able to yield orders of magnitude more in terms of productivity, and you don't use it, right? You're going to get in trouble. You're going to get fired if you're the CEO, right? So you're going to be actively looking for ways and means to embed AI into your operations to reduce the cost and to become much more productive, right? And your shareholders will expect that from you, right? So the pressure is there for corporations, large and small, right? Now, if we just stop there, if we look at this from the context of an employee, then where in Germany, for example, I was mentioning one of the largest tabloid newspapers have just decided to terminate 30% of its workforce, right? Because they're going to embrace AI, and they're saying things like the role of a proofreader, etc., is no longer necessary. And they say like, look, this is just the nature of the reality, and we have to do this. What happens to that person who's displaced, right? I keep hearing politicians and other people talk about reskilling and retraining, but we're making a lot of assumptions that there are ample opportunities to sort of retrain and reskill yourself, like to sort of adopt a different profession. What profession do you reskill to that is not at risk of being displaced, right? What does that say about your personal, your purpose? Like we talk so much about purpose, right? I want to be a caregiver, or I wanted to be a journalist since I was a boy, and now I'm finally a journalist, and I get kicked out, right? And I don't have a job anywhere because literally the profession has been displaced. It's not just me; it's the entire profession. What the hell do I do now? Go and be a cab driver, do what needs to be done, go be a caregiver, go be a counselor. I could, because I need to survive, but what does that then do to my state of mind, right? How do I feel about myself, right? It's almost you're being demoted, right? Not just from a financial perspective, but maybe from a stature perspective, right? Maybe from your expectations of yourself. You've got to sort of contend with that demotion, right? So
Mm.
how does that play out, right? And to me, if you just look at it from one person's perspective, it's quite depressing, right? And that's most of humanity today, where we're not all sitting at managerial posts, we're not all CEOs or entrepreneurs or whatever. We're actually just leading simple lives, in lower to middle management or just as basic employees, doing our jobs and trying to live our lives. If we get displaced, what do we do, right? Um, And that's the real crux of the issue, I feel. It's is that corporations are incentivized to accelerate displacement, right? Who is there to pick up the slack, right? Who is there to make sure that we're investing in all of these people who are now getting displaced and we're helping manage this problem, this growing problem? Who's going to pay for it? And there's so many sort of flow-on effects from this, right? Because now if people, more and more people, for example, and I'm exaggerating probably, more and more people get out of jobs, they can't pay taxes. If they can't pay taxes, what happens to governments? How do governments sort of run countries then, right? So there are all these flow-on effects, and I'm just barely scratching the surface. But you see what I'm talking about, right? That it's the fact that the change that it's instigating and that's forcing corporates to make these decisions will, in fact, displace a lot of people, right? And that's my concern. And I hope I'm wrong about everything I say. I hope I'm wildly wrong, right? But you're really seeing this play out, right? And that's the big concern that I have.
I think rightly so. Like
Yeah.
I completely see where you're coming from. Um, I think the key thread of what you're describing so far, and from the start of what you mentioned was the IQ level of, for example, ChatGPT 4, right? I think that puts a very heavy emphasis on the importance of retaining knowledge and information, right? Um, but I think, what if you were to test that same technology, in terms of its EQ, right? Um, I'm just kind of thinking like, and I don't mean to sort of simplify things, right? But years and years ago, I mean, I can't even like I'll search this, right? But when the electronic calculator replaced the abacus, um, do you think people were scared then, right? Um, I think what I'm trying to argue is that AI basically has this ability to condense information in an efficiency that now is going to, yeah, replace humans. And I think the fear of losing um, out on more knowledge based professions is definitely something that should be that one should be afraid of. Um, I think my personal opinion is it's proving the redundancies of the echoes of the past, where you were saying before we started this conversation that, like, our parents and our grandparents pushed us to, like, go for knowledge based careers, right? Like, be the accountant, be the lawyer, be the doctor, right? But within our lifetime, potentially with the capabilities of AI, we're going to be able to see um, those types of roles being completely replaced or partly replaced by AI. Um, and obviously, if there is a threat in that sense, yeah, like I'd be lying in saying that I don't feel a bit anxious about that. But I think it's also sort of come at the right time, in the sense that um, I'm sort of understanding the strengths of humanity. And I think it's not so much in our knowledge of things, because we've thrived for thousands of years with a severe lack of knowledge, right? And um, I think what has made us actually thrive is our ability to connect with one another, lean on each other. Um, that I think is something that's uniquely human. It's not so much our ability to interpret the world around us and condense the information out of it. You know, it's our ability to ask someone next to us, hey, why is the sky blue? I don't know, but let's figure it out together. Okay. And then they figured it out together, right? And AI is only making that kind of stuff more efficient. Um, I don't see anything wrong with that. Like, yeah, it's going to displace a whole bunch of jobs, and that's terrifying. But you know what? Like I mentioned this before, this has happened previously in previous decades. And you're right, maybe not on the scale that it could potentially happen with its increasing capabilities. But I think also we can't underestimate the ability of people and adjusting and adapting to the changes of the time. Um, because if that didn't happen, you and I wouldn't have been here. If human beings decades ago weren't able to adapt, um, humanity as we know it probably wouldn't have been here. Um, and so I think the debate, it seems, is almost intellectual and the accumulation of knowledge versus the emotional, compassion aspect. And I think when you're looking at that, humanity is always going to win, at least for now, anyway. AI will probably figure it out at some point. But I don't know. What do you think? Like, I kind of feel like what I'm saying is a little bit kumbaya, but I genuinely believe what I'm saying. Like that, you know, it's the thing that AI still hasn't quite figured out yet is that ability to connect and empathize and have compassion for its fellow person. And I don't think any amount of code and replication is quite ever going to figure it out. It could mimic it, but I don't know if it'll ever actually be able to feel that. Um, yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Very good question. And I'm trying my hardest. Please believe me that I'm trying my hardest to be optimistic. I'm really like sort of biting my tongue whenever I talk or write about this to, you know, not go down that rabbit hole, right? Of being a extreme alarmist or fear monger. Um, but I think I still don't believe there's a good reason to be optimistic. I see what you're saying, that humanity has always prevailed. They've always come together, um, and yes, people pull through because of mutual self-interest, and they see like, look, coming together, working together is better for you and I than if we were to go it alone, right? Um, but that probably made sense, when we had to encounter, I don't know, the last ice age, right? But we had to run from this massive floods from everywhere, right? Or from dinosaurs or from whatever, right? For the last 2,000 years, the amount of wars we've fought. Humanity has been a hard, I mean, like life has been a hard, if you just go through history, right? It's been hard, right? It's been beautiful, rich, rewarding, dramatic, painful, scary, terrifying. But I think the big question for me is that because we've never encountered technology like this, right? We can't really understand what the true implications are or what they might look like, right? But uh, if we sort of think about this logically and approach it and look at how us as humans have behaved in the past, right? And sort of infer from that what might happen, we can see a lot of bad things happening quite quickly, right? I talked about, the profit-seeking motive of all corporations, right, and the impact of that. I think if you think about just that fallout from that, right, that someone who's displaced, what it means for their state of mind, right, and the amount of insecurity and anxiety and stress that it'll induce in the person, right? Um, that enough, that happening at scale is enough to raise a lot of serious questions. If I were a politician, and I know that this is happening for a good chunk of members in my country, I'm going to be concerned that these people are going to be unhappy and they're going to be misbehaving soon, right? And what does that unrest look like? What are the good answers that I have to mitigate and to solve for that unrest, right? And I think right now we're sort of throwing a lot of easy, convenient answers at it, like reskilling or upskilling, but no one really understands what they're talking about, I feel, or they're not at least going down into the levels of detail that we need to be doing so, right? As I talked about, we talk about reskilling. Reskill to do what, right? If you look at the range of jobs that are being displaced, that in effect means you need to do more caregiving based jobs, right? Like being a counselor, being a therapist, being a caregiver, and there's certain other jobs, right? But everyone can't be competing for the same amount of jobs, right? Everyone can't be downscaling or going and pursuing those number of jobs because you have a question of oversupply, right? And not enough jobs to fulfill, right? And again, like, so what are all those other people going to do, right? And people, when they're desperate, right, to provide for their family, to provide for themselves, they're willing to go to desperate measures, right? And that is that consequence that I'm talking about, that we don't have good answers to mitigate that unrest, that anxiety, that fear that most people will be feeling, right? um and we've never seen this, like I said, we've never seen this at this scale, right? um and today, like, it's quite scary, right? If you think about it. So yeah, I guess I'm taking the opposite perspective from you, quite a pessimist. Um, but because only because I feel like there are more questions than answers today, right? And I tried
Hmm.
about this last night, right? Like, so that question about being displaced, I think we've covered this. But okay, what if you're a 20-year-old, right, or 19 or 18-year-old looking to, decide like, okay, what career should I embark on, right? Which university should I go to? What should I study? How do you answer that question? Right? Um, Most of what we would study would be, how do you know it won't be sort of automated in a few years, right? You can't probably do graphic design unless that evolves significantly, right? Uh, would you want to do law, for example? Would you want to do accounting? Would you want to do software development? All of which can be done by AI, right? So then you think about the entry level jobs, the first 2 to 3 years, right? All of those jobs can be done by AI, right? For most industries and most professions. How do I then bridge that gap to get up, you know, to that higher paying job, right? Or is that question no longer relevant, right? And how do I then sort of channel my youthful exuberance and optimism to feel positive about the world and life, right? So all these are questions that come up, right? And again, like, it goes down to the purpose. And we've been talking, a lot in recent decades about what is your purpose in life, finding your purpose in life, how to find your purpose in life. Now, in the face of so many questions where we don't have the answers to yet, how do I answer that question? What do I do with myself, right? What
Hmm.
purpose should I aspire to? And what does that mean for my identity as a person? Because if I just look at myself, I attach my sense of self-worth, for better or worse, so much to what I do for a living, right? And if I don't do anything, that naturally my sense of self-worth is very low, right? My sense of self-opinion is very low. So if now I can't reasonably expect to attach or identify with my job, to derive this sense of purpose and sense of self, what do I do then? Right? Like, what is the solution? That means I have to think about how to answer that question from a different perspective. And what does that look like? Right? So I feel like if I had to summarize everything I've just said, and I'm sorry for rambling, is this whole situation raises a lot more questions, which actually may eventually turn out for the better. But I see like the next couple of years, 5 to 10 years, being super tumultuous as we grapple with these questions and try to find answers, right? And funnily enough, that will require us to introspect individually and collectively, and to really figure out, like, look, you know, what the hell do we do? How do we find answers to these questions? Right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you raised a number of interesting points. Like I think so. You mentioned the 20-year-old that's entering the job market.
Yeah.
I think we both need to acknowledge that we suffer from the bias of our perspective, in the sense that when we picture the 20-year-old entering the job market, we're picturing ourselves when we were 20 entering the job market. And I can tell you right now, when I was 20 entering the job market, firstly, I wasn't in the job market. I guess like I was working like a part-time job at a call center that was near my university campus, right? Um, but when I did enter the job market, um, it was literally as the global financial crisis was hitting, and that was 2009. It was terrible. You know, like the first couple of years was depressing,
Mm.
right? But um, pulled through it, and and then eventually thrived, right? Um, and so I think what I'm trying to say is that like there have been tumultuous periods before, but I know from my own perspective that um, I've kind of pulled through despite a lot of factors being stacked against me.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, I think that might also be why I've got the perspective that I have, because um, I kind of feel like the concept of um, tumultuousness is sort of something that probably best describes like the first 20 to 25 years of my life on this earth, right? Like, um, and yet I came out of it with this really unique perspective where, despite a lot of the terrible things that was happening on a personal level, um, building this fantastic um, community of friends and and acquaintances that helped me get to where I am today, you know. Um, and so, you know, when we're looking at the current 20-year-old, I know purely based off of like my nephews and my nieces, that the I guess like education as we know it or as we knew it before is actually in many ways very different to the way that it is now, right? Um, I know from my partner who is in fact a teacher, talks about how the skills that are taught in class now isn't isn't very it's not so much about rote learning where you know you just memorize and regurgitate. It's more about looking at the world around you and interpreting it for yourself,
Mm.
right? As opposed to, you know, having a whole bunch of information shoved down your throat and expecting to just regurgitate that, you know. And I think the great thing about at least the education systems that are afforded here in Hong Kong, certainly at the international school curriculum, is that um, it makes people look at the world around them and encourages them to kind of think outside of the box, which I think also increases one's ability to adapt in an increasingly changing environment. And so I think um, we do need to kind of factor that in, right? That whatever perspective we have now suffers from a certain element of bias because whatever point of relation that we have from even 10, 15 years ago is slightly redundant
Yeah.
because the world around us is changing, and it's changing at an accelerated rate, right? And we talked about this before, right? Like some of the wisdom that was distilled by the generations before us, I think in certain aspects is useful, but there are other aspects of it that is quickly becoming redundant, right? And so I don't know, like I like I said, I mean, I can definitely see the yeah, I can see your point and your perspective of why all of this is going to be detrimental to many people. But I think I'm also, if anything, I'm extremely skeptical of this narrative and this mistrust of AI, because if it was in fact the case, right, that we should be terrified of this, um, I just don't think that like you'd be necessarily reading about it. You know, I think the fact that it's out there in the mainstream suggests that there might be an ulterior motive. And what I would try to argue is that AI may potentially offer the tools to empower the individual rather than getting stuck in this corporate system of thing, you know? Um, and I'm
There are
just
a
kind of
couple of
thinking
things wrong.
like,
Sorry to interrupt.
okay, yeah, no, that's fine, but let me just finish my point.
Yeah.
I think that in many aspects, like I would argue that AI could potentially offer the tools for one to be able to start their own business, you know, instead of working as an employee in an enormous corporation. Um, but yeah, go on. Like I'm definitely interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like the tools are empowering, and I think today, like we are flooded. If you go on like LinkedIn or Twitter, everyone's talking about AI, and there's all these new AI tools that are coming up, AI based tools that are coming out that lets you do all sorts of things. And I'm overwhelmed, as I think most people are, just by the number of tools and the capability of these tools, right? And just to give you some idea, like I'm in the creative entrepreneurial profession, right? Most of what I do can be automated, right? And some firms out there have already sort of taken the leap and said, yeah, we're actually just going to build AI tools to make our lives super easy, which means you don't have to,
Thanks, Hardesh. Here's the door.
yeah, exactly.
We'll give you a glowing reference.
Yeah,
Shit, that sucks.
but when I saw that, I was so happy because I was thinking, look, can't the natural application is that more and more people will think like that, and they'll go and set up their own firms, right, and try and develop an AI enabled service. But everyone's thinking about doing the same thing, right? And so if you think about it from the client's perspective, client knows that you're going to be delivering your work with AI assistance. So why should you earn as much, right? Imagine a lawyer, right? So lawyers charge by the hour, right? How do they justify that today if they decide to leverage AI to write their briefs, to peer review this, to double check? All that can be done in a fraction of time. And the client will naturally ask, like, why should I pay you as much, right? When you're probably using it. So how does a lawyer then justify, commanding such high fees? And so you can see this natural flow-on effect, right? Another thing is, who owns the AI? It's not a public good. It's a private, it's private property. It's owned by corporations, right? You're already seeing. I was listening to this morning. So if you're building a large language model, right, you need data for basically the algorithms to learn from, right? So where are these data pools? You look at Reddit as a platform. uh, as a platform for data, right? It's a lot of, nuanced information that, will be wonderful to learn from. You look at Twitter, you look at Facebook. So what you're seeing is each of these corporations are now building silos, and they're saying if any other platform like OpenAI wants access to our information via an API, you've got to pay for it, right? So you see all these corporations that, because they were much more open before, and which sort of contributed to the rise of the free and democratic internet, that's now sort of changing, and they're becoming much more siloed, right? And we, the unwitting consumers, keep giving our data for free to all these platforms, and they're making more and more money, right? So you know what I'm saying? Like, it's, you
Hmm.
see all these consequences sort of arise, and then you think like, okay, it can empower the individual, but that's actually not true. It's very short-term thinking, right? If everybody's using AI, naturally the wages will go down, the cost of services will go down. How do you differentiate yourself? Like, literally, I was struggling to think about this yesterday. I was just doing a thought experiment. How would I differentiate myself? Because everything that I know how to do, I rely on my mind and my ability to think and access information and process information. AI can do that, way, way better than I can possibly hope to. So how do I actually differentiate myself if the only way I've ever known how to do that is by thinking and processing information? And now the question that comes down to, hey, Hardesh, maybe you're just never going to be as smart as AI. And now, now we have to contend with that fact. You're just dumber, Hardesh. You're just part of a dumber species. And how do you feel about that? It's quite terrifying because we've never been here before, right? For the longest period of time, we were the most intelligent species on the planet. Now that's at risk. What does that mean, right?
Yeah, but like, I mean, I totally see where you're coming from,
I
but when
love
you
that you're
look,
still optimistic.
yeah, when you look at like computers, right?
Yeah,
They process information a lot faster than humans have done. And what did we do, right? Like, I mean, we didn't take this thing and throw it out the window, right? Um, like I think it's you're right. Like in what you said before we started recording all of this, in the wrong hands,
yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah,
potentially devastating, right?
exactly.
But um, we also can't negate the stakeholders, which is human civilization, to ensure that this won't happen. And you're right, like, large corporations in the effort to maintain the bottom line, um, they're they're always gonna sort of have a bit of a say in the matter. Um, Likewise, governments as well. Um, but also at the same time, these platforms and these tools that are making these large companies millions and billions are also allowing people to connect at an accelerated rate. It affords us information that a lifetime ago would have taken an entire lifetime to reach, right? The fact that I can settle an argument with a quick Google search, like, hey, when was the Magna Carta? Like I remember, like actually, I wouldn't personally remember this, but I'm sure that like people that are 10 to 15 years older than me can recall times where they had dinner discussions where people were arguing things back and forth that now could arguably just be done with a quick Google search, right? Um, yeah, like I think your points are definitely valid, but I would still argue that the this sort of mistrust um, and I guess like the potential for what this thing that is now AI could potentially do to a large portion of human civilization is potentially enormous, right? But I would again, I'd argue that AI is now the topic of discussion. Before this, it was something else,
Yeah.
right? It was the internet, and then it was nuclear arsenal. It was and still is global warming, um, climate change, right? Um, and so I think, yeah, like we certainly shouldn't be like going at it with the kind of optimism that I've got, where it's just like, yeah, we're all going to be able to like work for ourselves and start our own companies and yada, yada, yada. You're right. Like, there's definitely people that are going to end up getting displaced, and, you know, their 15, 20, potentially 30 years of work going down the toilet overnight. Right. And
Yeah.
that is terrifying. Um, but again, these things happen in cycles, right? Like I mentioned earlier, when I entered the job market in 2009, um, it was at the height of the financial crisis. Before that, it was 2003,
Yeah.
when the previous downturn happened. Before that, it was 1997. Before that, it was 1992. Before that, it was 1986 or 87.
Yeah.
So these things happen, right? Um, I don't see anything wrong with that. Like, it puts us in a very uncomfortable situation, but through that discomfort is where I feel like a tremendous amount of growth happens. And whilst it ideally one would like to grow and evolve in a more comfortable environment, and I'm not necessarily implying from a sadistic perspective that like, yeah, pain is good, like, I'm just saying that like, if AI does in fact go down the path that you're describing, I am 100% confident that we're going to come out of this better for it.
If we survive.
um yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, James Cameron has would have a different argument, with his take on on Skynet
Yeah.
and whatnot. But nah, like I think I just don't think we're gonna actually end up getting there.
The thing is,
Um,
if I can just, I'm sorry, but you made a few.
don't apologize. Look, you keep apologizing. Like, I really like your perspective. I like that we're on the other side of this fence. This fence being this topic, like, because I I can definitely see your perspective, like, and I completely understand it. So don't apologize. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
say what you wanted to say.
there's something in that you said that was quite, it's quite important, right? It's not the technology, and this is something that someone else said, right? That I was watching on YouTube, and it's not the technology itself that's bad. It's the people in whose hands, it is, that makes the situation bad, right? It's like, um, giving a 5-year-old, a flamethrower, right? And teaching the 5-year-old, like, just press this button and fire comes out, right? The 5-year-old is not going to understand the consequences of walking around a neighborhood and pressing that button on a flamethrower, right? And that's kind of what, it's a very poor analogy, but that's kind of what it's like, where we've now built this tool and we're just not
Hmm.
smart enough to understand the consequences and the flow-on effects. And I'm pessimistic about our ability to come together to answer those questions, because look at climate change, right? Um,
Hmm.
how long has it taken us to just get our act together? And now we've, I think, collectively admitted that 1.5 degrees hitting that, that benchmark is not going to happen, right? Think about nuclear weapons, right? We're still talking about why it's not a good idea to use nuclear weapons, right? And this is the point that someone else made, right? Which is 60, 70 years on after the invention of like nuclear weapons. So the pessimism arises from an observation of how human beings behave and how human beings think and operate, right? Like this thing that I was watching yesterday, they said, look, most of the money an investment into AI has gone into what? Killing people, which is defense, right? Selling arms, gambling, right? Which is, trading, speculating, financial speculation, and selling shit on Instagram through your algorithms and all that. That's what humanity, puts money into. And if you look at funding on the opposite side to better humanity, it's not as much as what you would see, right? Because these things sell, right? So if you just look at those simple facts, it gives you reason to be concerned. And again, not with the technology, but at our own ineptitude and our own inability to get our act together, right? We can't even come to an alignment like, look, if climate change is such a real problem, maybe we shouldn't keep prioritizing profits, over the planet, over, more existential issues, right? So we can't get that. We can't get that right, right? So why do you think we'll get this right with AI, right? When there's actually no way to even regulate it, there's no way to think about how to prevent bad actors and criminals from utilizing this tool. You and I may not do it because we are ethical people, right? But what's stopping a criminally minded person from doing it? I came across an example yesterday. It was quite funny, but it's quite true, right? Like, what is the ultimate cliche for a bad guy to make money from all the movies that you've seen, right? Build a bomb or a weapon, and either you sell it to the highest bidder or you ransom the world. Pay me $1 billion, and I won't bomb the shit out of you, right? Guess what? AI now, there's a recent paper where they just did a simple, it's supposed to be a joke, but some scientists just twisted an algorithm and just got the tool to suggest 40,000 new ways to kill humanity, new viruses that it could engineer to kill humanity. So anyone
Oh.
sitting anywhere can just
Yikes.
build that out and sell it to people, right? Because that's the quickest way to make money and gain power, right? So you can see all these simple things sort of coming through very quickly in the hands of bad actors, right? So it gives you reason for pause, and and that's why I guess I'm quite pessimistic. But I guess to bring it back to the point we were making, the key question for me, I think, that's relevant to this podcast is, what does it mean for you and I individually, right? How do we comprehend the situation without losing our minds, right? Because we've
Hmm.
never had to do this before. We've never had to contend with the fact that we may not be smartest, species on Earth anymore. And how does that make us feel about ourselves? How do we derive a new sense of purpose? How do we contend with this rising ambiguity, uncertainty? And I think those are the key questions, right? I don't have good answers to that, but I think a lot of things that you said at the start is quite relevant. Try and keep your shit together first. Be be calm, and try and adopt a balanced perspective. But aside from that, I'm not sure what else you can do, man. What do you think?
Well, I think it's also like just having faith in the fact that the world does keep spinning, even if we don't
Even
necessarily
if we're
have the answers to it, right? Like, because you're saying that like we're no longer the smartest
yeah,
species on the planet, and yet like how did we even get to this point in the first place, right? Like, because there are built-in processes around us that have allowed us to thrive. Um, and I have faith in the fact that even if even with things potentially as detrimental as AI, um, that the world will keep turning,
yeah,
right? Like, um, yeah, like it could potentially put a lot of people in a deeply uncomfortable position. Um, and that could come with struggles for a significant amount of time. Um, but but that is just a fact of life, right? Like we can't always be comfortable. We can't always be thriving. Um, and I don't know, like it's a tricky thing. Like I'm not saying that like I hope that you're right. Like if anything, I'm just saying that even if you are right, the world's just going to keep turning,
Yeah,
and we will keep on going. Um, because you're saying that there's now this thing that's smarter than us, but I mean, I would argue in various factors, there's always been something out there that is better in certain aspects than us, right? Like animals that are stronger than us, faster than us, and yet here we still are, right? Um, and so I get your point, but once again, humans have proven time and time again that our ability to band together and rely on one another, and then harness the capabilities of the things around us. Um, and I get your argument in the sense that this could potentially only be advantageous for like a small percentage of the people at the top. Um, but the reality is that that small percentage relies and thrives on the happiness and satisfaction of the rest of the human population. And if we're not, they will be held accountable, and they have been held accountable. Um, so I'm I'm not too worried, really. Um, I have full faith in our ability to get through this, whatever this potentially will be. Um, but I think I kind of feel like we've been talking about the issue this entire time. Have we sort of talked about the potential solutions,
but
or
that's the thing, right?
things to kind of look out for, or are we all, is all we're doing just pointing out the potential ramifications or
Yeah,
negative impact of this?
yeah, and that's the thing, right? So it's the way I've seen this play out. It's you can take one route, which a lot of people are doing, right, online. They are trying to promote different AI tools and different use cases. And then, and that's happening on a massive scale. A lot of people are doing it. And then if you look on the other side, there are a smaller group of people who are sitting here and pointing out, like, guys, there's a lot to be concerned about if you think this just from a second order perspective, right? After sort of promoting AI and getting excited about it, if you think about what's next, there's a lot to be concerned about. And then we haven't even understood how to articulate a lot of these questions because there's so many questions and you can't find answers until you understand, the questions that you're asking, right? Um, and today, based on the answers that we have, we don't seem to have a lot of good answers, right? It's like the tsunami is coming, right? Hitting everywhere, everyone all at the same time, right? And then you're like, okay, fuck, like, what do I do? Where do I run? Right? And it's a bit like that situation, right? Um, and you don't know where to go to, right? Right now, everyone's talking about regulating AI. Everyone's talking about coming together to get governments to impose these regulations. It's not going to happen, realistically speaking, right? It'll be very hard to enforce, very hard to implement. Um, and then if you think about it from an individual's perspective, what can I personally do? Um, I can sit here and think about, okay, what's the next profession that the world needs? And right now, all I've personally gotten up to are two, right? So um, a philosopher, from an ethics perspective, someone who sits there and sort of raises these important questions, or a caregiver, or someone who's in a skills-based employment where you're actually working with your hands and you're building shit. Well, that's going to be relevant until robots come and take over your job, right? But right now, I think those seem to me to be the professions that are least at risk. Obviously, I'm missing out a lot more service-based occupations, right? And I'm not saying that all lawyers or all doctors will be made redundant. I'm just saying that we won't have as much of a need for as many lawyers and as many doctors and accountants and consultants as we have had today, right? A lot of these people will be made irrelevant, right? And it's just, a natural consequence of capitalism, right? If I run McKinsey, for example, and I know by employing AI, I can get 3/4 of the work done at 90% cost, a lower cost, I'll do it, right? And that's just natural, right? I win, right? Because that's the nature, that's what I'm supposed to do, right? What happens to all of those people? They might go off and think about starting little McKinseys, right? But what happens if everybody does this, in every profession all at the same time, right? What does that look like? I don't know. So in terms of answers, I don't know. I don't have any good answers. I want to tell people to learn how to meditate and stay calm to protect their mental health, because I think that's going to be super crucial, right? But I also think that a large part of this has to do with settling for a simpler life, like what we talked about previously. You actually have to lower your expectations, I feel, almost. In the face of so much uncertainty, you need to conserve and protect yourself, right? And that means lowering your expectations, right? And doing what needs to be done to protect yourself and your loved ones and your interests and your longevity, right? Until answers start popping up, do you then sort of raise your head from above the sand, like, okay, that way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, like managing and adjusting your expectations, right? Because I think again, we were given this I feel like many of us growing up were given this roadmap of, if you do A and then B and then C, then you will get to this sort of uh top of the hill, and you'll be able to thrive and lead a relaxing enjoyable life. But like again, I think the reality is that it's again the bias um, of that perspective and that advice coming from a different.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, so I was just saying, like, so I think like you were mentioning earlier that it's going to be really difficult to monitor the effects of AI. And yeah, you're right. Like I think when when you look back at the history of the economy, the reality is that updates and new laws and regulations have been put in as a reaction to something that has happened that has deeply impacted um, human society, right? Like you look at anti-monopoly laws, and then the laws that were implemented as a result of the last global financial crisis. I think the reality is that whatever the tsunami that you're describing, um, the sooner it happens, the faster governments can react to implement the relevant regulations to um, I guess minimize the the potentially damaging effects of AI, right? Um, so I would argue that like the sooner it happens, the better,
Yeah,
just so we can kind of like pick up the pieces and start rebuilding, right?
yeah.
But you're also completely right. Like I think with whatever is potentially coming, um, these tools of like meditation, self-reflection, managing your expectations, adjusting your priorities, asking yourself what is truly important, um, are things that everyone's going to have to contend with, right? I think the saddest thing to me is many um, are the people that have spent almost their entire lives clawing their way out of the lower income status into middle income status that are going to be set back substantially even more so than what COVID has done to many of them already, right? Um, but I mean, the reality is that these things happen, um, and people just try their best to keep going,
Yeah.
right? Um, and then you hope to God that like once everything is settled down, that you're still around and still intact, and that the people that are most important to you are still there to help pick up the pieces with you.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, like I don't think that either of us are necessarily offering a specific solution, but I don't think if you look back at any of our previous episodes that we've ever prescribed a specific set of steps or solutions to any of the topics that we discuss.
Yeah.
But there is a very, I guess, common thread in that, you know, a lot of things that we're doing, you know, and just having the act of these conversations, I think is what's gonna help us um, moving forward. And I think it's something that's gonna, I guess, it's sort of gonna be the thing that sort of separates us from AI. You know, again, our ability to connect, to empathize, and be compassionate with one another. Um, yeah, that's
Yeah.
all I got.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think yeah, it's about having that conversation, right? And really trying to bring more attention and awareness and brain power, human brain power to this to these questions, right? And hopefully we arrive at a useful or better place, right?
Yeah,
On that note, to everyone listening, please tell us what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? If so, why? And if you think this will help, please tell your friends about us and help us spread the word. On that note, thank you, sir.
good chatting with you, man. Good chatting with you, man. Sorry,
Take care, bro.
got my tongue twisted then. Yeah, you too, man. Till
Ciao.
next time.